let's stay in the Bay of Fundy. The Bay of Fundy, as I said, especially the Minas Basin, is known for having the world's largest tidal range, anywhere between 15 to 16 meters. And here's an image, once again, taken from NASA, the NASA Earth Observatory, showing high tide April 20th, 2001, and then low tide September 30th, 2002. There's nothing really significant about these days. It's just when that particular satellite was overhead and was able to snap these images. And you can get a really good idea of the difference between high tide and low tide. So once again, tidal patterns, are they diurnal? Are they semi-diurnal? Do we have a macro tidal range? Do we have a micro tidal range? Are dependent on the ocean basin shape and the size. So here we have a very smaller basin, very restricted. That's going to have an effect on what is going on in terms of tidal range as well as tidal patterns here in the basin. This brings us to the concept of amphidomic points. So an amphidomic point is a geographical location. You're not going to go there and there's going to be a sign saying this is an amphidomic point, but it's a location where we see almost no vertical movement from tidal activity. So you can say that the tidal range is almost zero. And what we see is tides propagate in a circular pattern around them. This is why there's a variation in tides. This is why in some areas you might have a tidal range that is 10 meters. In other areas you might have a tidal range of 2 meters or a meter, even less than that. Amphidomic points occur due to the Coriolis effect. We all love the Coriolis effect by this point. And interference from ocean basins. We're basically in a basin, so water is going to travel, as we know, and eventually hit land. What happens is it creates a wave pattern called an amphidomic system. And these wave patterns travel or rotate around the amphidomic point. So the node, that's that middle there. You can sort of see there's those little arrows, that black arrows that go either point to the left or point clockwise or point counterclockwise around them, is an area where there's no tide. That's the amphidomic point. And then the lines that spread out from it are called cotidal lines, and they show the sort of the time lag of when the tide or the crest of the tide will be occurring there. These are also sometimes referred as tidal spiders. So if you're starting here and you're going, okay, this really isn't making a lot of sense, I don't want you to panic yet. We'll make sure that there is a website that you can go to and read and kind of read up on this a little bit more. And we'll see if the next few slides help as well in the understanding of how these play a role in tidal patterns around the world. Let's take a closer look at this. So in one way you can think about this sort of as water sloshing back and forth in a basin. But we'll talk about this in a little greater detail. So one of the things that happens is land gets in the way of the water boulders that are created by gravity inertia. Those water boulders are sitting out there, the earth is rotating around it, and it's not going to be all of a sudden saying, oh, hey, we're underneath a water bulge, we've got to shift the position of our coastlines. They're stationary. Those water bulges, in a sense, are stationary as well. So let's imagine a big closed basin, and we're surrounded by continents. So the North Atlantic is a good example, but in this case here we'll go completely surrounded by land. What happens here is the water can't freely bulge and follow the moon's track because that water bulge wants to stay underneath the moon. So water is going to try to swell as the Earth rotates. For example, we're in the North Atlantic. So as Europe rotates towards the moon's position, gravity pull becomes larger, water will start to accumulate on the European side of the ocean basin. For example, now the European side of the Atlantic basin. Then, as the rest of the basin, the American continent, so North America, follow suit, get closer to the moon in that sense, water is going to start to flip over to the other side and accumulate closer to the North American side of the basin. So what we have is this big sloshing wave that moves back and forth, and sort of that midpoint, that node that we see there, is the point around which the sloshing occurs. The center remains the same wave height, but water will generate higher and lower tides on either side of the ocean basin. Now remember, the good old Coriolis effect always has to be considered. So what we were talking about before was if there is no Coriolis effect. Remember, we have that water sloshing back and forth, but we also have the Coriolis effect that wants to deflect that water to the right. The net effect of the sloshing back and forth of the water, and this is irrespective of any tide or of any currents, any wave activity, combine that with the Coriolis effect, and you'll see that tides sort of sweep through the basin in the northern hemisphere counterclockwise, almost like the hands of a clock. So at one point in the day, we'll have a high tide here, and then later on the high tide will occur here in a basin, there, and there. It's a whole lot to take in here, but just remember, land gets in the way, Coriolis effect plays a role, and we have water sloshing back and forth, and this is going to end up with sort of this movement of tides in sort of a big circle around the amphidomic point, that point where we have zero tidal range. Let's look at a couple of examples. We're going to look at sort of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, north of Prince Edward Island, and then this example, this excellent example that's in our own backyard here at Acadia, the Bay of Fundy. So we have two different shaped basins here. You can see right away by this map here, the Bay of Fundy is narrow, it's more constricted. We have this wider body of water that's moving into it, whereas we see that the Gulf of St. Lawrence sort of outlined in this big red circle here, much open. There's really no restricting or narrowing of water or the passage of water anywhere within that particular red area outlined by red. So here's an example of what happens sort of in a larger basin, for example, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but you can see what we talked about in the previous slides. Once again, Coriolis effect is playing a role. The fact that this bulge of water, as we rotate underneath it, as the earth moves underneath it, land gets in the way, and we can see that sort of difference in tide occurring from where it is, high tide is at 0 hours all the way up to where high tide occurs at 6 hours, 8 hours, and then 10 hours. And that dashed line, so the circular dashed lines coming out, those are actually the tidal ranges. So we go anywhere from about 0 all the way up to 2 meters of tidal range. So we have here what's likely a microtidal tidal range. It's a slightly different story, though, now when we look at the Bay of Fundy between the coastlines of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So in this case now, we're dealing with a narrow, restricted basin. One of the main things here is that tidal wave crest, the thing that we saw rotating sort of counterclockwise in the open ocean basin of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, is that we can't have that tidal crest rotating around the amphidomic point. In this narrow restricted basin, what we see now is that the wave crest of the tide, so when you go from high tide to low tide, as we pass out from underneath that bulge of water and then back underneath that bulge of water, it moves in and out of the basin. It doesn't sweep around the basin, but moves in and out. What happens with the Bay of Fundy, though, is that we see that the basin has a natural resonance. So the water in the bay naturally resonates, and this resonance occurs roughly the same frequency as the lunar tide. So, for example, if you think of water along the coast of Nova Scotia, at times of the day, it's sort of sloshing up over on that side, this naturally occurring resonance, and we're not going to get into why this is occurring, but the natural resonance is matched with incoming high tide, which causes even a greater, higher tidal range. And this is why we have tidal ranges, especially where you see the black arrow pointing up to 15 meters a day in places like Burnt Coat Head of the Minas Basin. So we'll end off the lecture by looking at this picture, image taken of Halls Harbor in Nova Scotia. Definitely a low tide. You can see by where that sort of that green line is along on the right-hand side where some of the boats are. That marks where high tide is. You can come here during periods of low tide and actually walk down, touch the ocean floor if you want to. And that's it for our lecture on tides. If you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, feel free to contact me. Don't hesitate to contact me. Have a good day.